But I'd like to begin by reading short excerpts from the works of two very different authors. The first is the Scottish author, Nan Shepherd, a native of the city of Aberdeen, where I also live. Shepherd was a teacher by profession, but also a keen walker who spent many long days roaming the Cairngorm Mountains. During the 1940s, she wrote a little book in praise of the Cairngorms. Entitled The Living Mountain, it was left in a desk drawer and not published until 1977. And even then, few knew of the book, and only in the last few years has it emerged as a classic of Scottish literature, so celebrated indeed that Shepherd's portrait now appears on £5 banknotes issued by the Bank of Scotland. So here she is. And here she is too, describing what it feels like to stretch out on the mountaintop. I'll just read this out. So there I lie on the plateau. Under me, the central core of fire from which was thrust this grumbling, grinding mass of plutonic rock. Over me, the blue air. And between the fire of the rock and the fire of the sun, scree, soil and water, moss, grass, flower and tree, insect, bird and beast, wind, rain and snow, the total mountain. Slowly, I have found my way in. Well, my second author is the ecological psychologist James Gibson, whose classic monograph entitled The Ecological Approach to Visual Perception was first published in 1979. Gibson begins by setting out the key constituents of the terrestrial environment as they would manifest themselves to a perceiver placed within it. The environment consists, he says, of three components, namely a medium, substances, and the surfaces that separate substances from the medium. Just to continue in his words, and I'm reading out what I just projected there, our planet consists mainly of earth, water, and air, a solid, a liquid, and a gas. The earth forms a substratum. The water is formed by the substratum into oceans, lakes, and streams. And the formless gases of the air make a layer of atmosphere above the earth and the water. The interface between any two of these three states of matter, solid, liquid, and gas, constitutes a surface. So the earth-water interface at the bottom of a lake is one such. The water-air interface at the top is another. And the earth-air interface is a third, the most important of all surfaces for terrestrial animals. This is the ground. It is the ground of their perception and behavior, both literally and figuratively. It is their surface of support. So let's compare these two passages. For both Shepherd and Gibson, atmospheric air is up above, and the earth is deep down below. But what lies between sky and earth? Well, for Gibson, this sketch here, what lies between sky and earth is the ground, conceived as a solid platform of support that separates the air above from the earth below. But for Shepherd, what lies between is, well, everything, what she called the total mountain. So what is going on here? How can there be such different views? And which is right? Well, in Gibson's characterization, as we've seen, the ground is an earth-air interface. So here it is coming in between the earth and the sky. Now, by definition, an interface has two sides, whether a top side and an underside, as here, or an outside and an inside. While the interface serves to keep the two sides separate, confined to their respective domains, it is also perforated by holes, by holes or by keys that allow information and sometimes materials to pass from one side to the other. A metalled road or pavement, for example, could be perforated by drains that allow rainwater through to underground channels, or manholes that allow human access to subsurface infrastructure. The paved surfaces of the city, of course, also provide support for its inhabitants. Indeed, the campaign to pave the urban environment in the modern era was driven above all by its twin functions of support and separation. On the one hand, the paved surface provided a secure foundation for fast and efficient transport, above all by means of wheeled vehicles, which might otherwise become stuck in mud or overturned by surface irregularities. On the other hand, paving was considered of benefit to public health, since it sealed the ground, preventing the stench of the earth from rising into the air, where in those days it was believed to cause illness among those who breathed it. Yet, on a paved surface, nothing can grow. For growth to occur, it's necessary for carbon dioxide in the air to bind with rainfall already absorbed into the soil and taken up by the roots in the presence of sunlight. This is photosynthesis, and all life depends on it. Thus, in the growth of living things, earth and air meet and mingle. This image here is a sketch from one of Paul Clay's sketchbooks, in which he depicts what he saw as the three stages of plant formation. There's a point of germination here in the roots, and then at that point extends outward in the growth of the stem, with the flower here at the top. So you see that the plant is not in any way on the ground. Rather, the ground is somewhere in the middle of what Clay here depicts as a sort of wave function. So in the growth of living things, earth and air meet and mingle. But where the ground has been paved, growth is only possible through cracks in the pavement. That is until the surface itself, overwhelmed by the elemental forces of earth and air, eventually crumbles. But let's now leave the city for the countryside, or join with Shepherd in the mountains. And here the ground is not paved, and its surface has only one side, not two. It is not an interface, it is not hard, and for plants at least, it is not a surface of support, but a medium. Plants, as Clay showed here, plants grow in the ground, they don't rest upon it. And what matters to the plant is the depth to which light can penetrate. So from the plant's point of view, the ground is not really a coherent foundation at all, but an indistinct and permeable limit of illumination, above which it shoots out green leaves, but below which it adopts the different habit of root growth. So how can we describe this kind of surface? Now, to answer this question, I would like to draw an analogy between the ground of habitation and the page of writing. It's an ancient analogy that can even be traced etymologically to the origin of the English word page, which comes from the Latin pagus, meaning an area of inhabited countryside with its farms and fields, from which are also derived the English word peasant for the farmer, or paysan in French, and the French word paysage also for the landscape, itens. These words all come from the same Latin root. So the act of writing with pen on parchment would then be likened to that of tilling the fields with the plough. So on the left here, we have the frontispiece from a copy of Piers Plowman, the 14th century book. And here we have an illustration of Lawrence, the prior of Durham, writing in the 12th century. And it was quite usual for monks at the time to compare the way they labored with the pen on the page with the way in which the farmer labors with a plough on the field. So the act of writing with pen on parchment was likened to that of tilling the fields with the plough. And in the days when almost everyone knew how to handle a plough, but few could write, it was a very natural comparison to make. Now, of course, the situation is reversed. Almost everyone can write, but how many of us still know how to handle a plough? Now, the parchment that medieval scribes used for their principal writing material was highly absorbent. It was also very expensive. And for that reason, it was common for the same material to be used over and over again. To reuse a parchment that has already been written upon, you have first to scrape the surface with a knife so as to remove as much of the original traces as possible. And you can then write again. And in principle, you can repeat this operation over and over until eventually the parchment is scraped so thin that it is no longer usable. However, since the material is so absorbent, the traces of previous writing can almost never be completely removed. So on a parchment that has been used several times, recent inscriptions appear to cut through the ever fainter traces of earlier ones, giving rise to what students of writing call a palimpsest. And this is a 13th century palimpsest with the 13th century writing here, and behind, or apparently behind, is writing left over, actually in Greek, from a 6th century text. Now, modern readers, conditioned by their familiarity with the printed word, can all too easily jump to the conclusion that the formation of the palimpsest is equivalent to overprinting, in which one layer of inscription is simply added over another. But a closer look at how the palimpsest is formed reveals it to be precisely the opposite. So let me explain by means of this diagram here. To explain this, it shows a parchment in exaggerated cross-section. So here's the top surface of the parchment, so that a line appears as a vertical mark. You're looking at it in cross-section. The line appears as a vertical mark as wide as the line is thick and as deep as the ink sinks into the fabric of the parchment. So here's the top of the parchment, and here's a line that has been drawn, and the ink has sunk right in from the top down here, right down to there. So in the diagram, I've indicated two lines inscribed at time t0, this line here and this one here. Suppose that later, at time t1, this surface is scraped and two new lines, so we take this top off, we bring it down to here, and two new lines are inscribed here and here, close to the old ones. And then suppose that we do the same thing again at time t2. We scrape the parchment again and draw two new lines here and here. Now, looking at the surface at time t2, just look at what has happened to the traces. The original traces from time t0 are only just visible right at the surface and will probably disappear if the parchment is used again. The traces from time t1 are shallower than they were, but are still very clear. But deepest of all are the traces, the most recent traces from time t2. So you see, far from past inscriptions sinking ever further down as new ones are added on top, quite the reverse occurs. It is the past that rises even as it is undercut by the present. And it's just the same with the ground. Archaeologists in particular have seized upon the metaphor of the palimpsest to refer to a ground that over the ages has been repeatedly used, eroded, and used again. One of the originators of the analogy, the archaeologist Osbert Crawford, writing in the early 1950s, expressed it thus. The surface of England, sorry about the nationalist overtones, just forget that. The surface of England, he says, is like a palimpsest, a document that has been written on and erased over and over again. And it is the business of the field of archaeology to decipher it. The features concerned are, of course, the roads and field boundaries, the woods, the farms and other habitations, and the other products of human labour. These are the letters and words inscribed on the land. Well, suppose that you are surveying a landscape for evidence of ancient trackway. You find that the most ancient tracks, worn by feet from centuries past, are now barely visible traces on the surface, on the point of vanishing. And this here on the left shows the remains of a Roman road in Yorkshire in the north of England. It's pretty much, well, it's on the point of disappearing. And will disappear before long. By contrast, the newest incisions, recently cut in the landscape and not yet subject to significant erosion, are strongly marked. So here is a road cutting, a modern road cutting from Fife in Scotland, not far from where I live. And in between are historic traces that, while manifestly weather-beaten and sometimes obscured, are still easy to recognize. Thus, in the land, just as on parchment, the past is not buried under the present, but actually closest to the surface, while the present, undercutting the past, digs deepest. The past comes up as the present goes down. And this is not a layering so much as a turning over. And keep this idea in mind because I'll return to it. Now, were it the case that the ground is really an interface between the substances of the earth and the atmospheric medium, as Gibson imagined it, then it would look in cross-section something like this. Here's the atmosphere above, the earth below, and the ground marking the layer in between with its top side and its underside. But outside the paved environment of the city, the ground, we've seen, has no topside or underside, and it doesn't hold the earth and the atmosphere apart. On the contrary, as Shepherd understood, it is the zone of their interpenetration. It is a palimpsest. And the ground as palimpsest doesn't separate earth from sky or serve as an interface mediating exchanges between the two. It's rather where earth and sky are rolled into one, where rain meets soil and turns it into mud, where wind meets sand and blows it into dunes, where snow meets ice and coats the surface in a blanket of white. Here, to recall Shepherd's words, between blue sky and bedrock are scree, soil and water, moss, grass, flower and tree, insect, bird and beast, wind, rain and snow. Now the ground thus understood exemplifies what I want to call a deep surface, formed as the Earth's rising up or eruption meets the atmosphere's beating down or erosion. The ground has depth, but is of no measurable thickness. Should we attempt to measure it, we would find that starting from the lower atmospheric horizon, there's no limit to how far up we could go, and that conversely, starting from the upper earthly one, we could keep on going down without ever reaching rock bottom. And I hope this diagram here shows what I mean. So the ground is in the point of the zone of interpenetration between the atmosphere beating down and the Earth rising up. And the double meaning of the English word to wear aptly illustrates this understanding of the ground as a deep surface. The word wear can mean to put on, as in wearing clothes, but it can also mean to strip off, as a surface that is worn by use or by exposure to the elements. Now, if the surface were truly an interface, then these meanings would be directly contradictory. But with the palimpsest, they are one and the same, because it's in the very process of erosion that depth comes to the surface. This is a surface that covers, but doesn't cover up. And such, indeed, is the surface of the ground. Now, one thinker who came close to picturing the ground in these terms was the Victorian critic and connoisseur John Ruskin. Introducing the fifth and final volume of his Modern Painters, published in 1860, Ruskin described the ground as a veil of strange intermediate being. At bottom, Ruskin argued the earth is dead and cold, but at its surface, in the textures of its meadows and forests, rocky outcrops, moor and heath, the ground ministers to its inhabitants through this veil. Perhaps then we could follow Ruskin in thinking of the ground as a veil of intermediacy rather than a plane of separation. Ruskin himself began with the injunction to dress it and keep it. Dressing here is an act of care, of looking after. The veil covers but does not cover up. It is a revelation, not a disguise. Imagined as a veil, the ground doesn't hide the earth's depth beneath its surface, but allows us to feel the depth in its surface. But the ground can also deceive. And this is how camouflage works. It tricks the perceiver into supposing that what is actually an interfacial, double-sided surface, covering up things hidden within or beneath, is really a one-sided deep surface, like that of a veil, which is open to the sky rather than closed off against it. And here in this very rough sketch, I compared a one-sided surface, so it's a little bit of a mound, but this is just the ground. And here, where these things are supposed to be tanks that the military commander has hidden. He wants to hide his tanks, so he covers them with a tarpaulin, which of course has two sides. He covers them with a tarpaulin, but paints the tarpaulin in motley shades of brown and green, so that to reconnaissance aircraft flying overhead, it just looks like more ground. And so people think, well, there's nothing there. It's just the ground. It just has one side. So that's the trick of camouflage, is to present what is actually a two-sided surface as if it was a one-sided surface that therefore has nothing to hide. So, so an open ground, because it has no other side, since it covers but doesn't cover up, appears to have nothing to hide. And really, of course, there are these tanks being hidden underneath. Now, I want to loop back to the idea of turning that I introduced a moment ago by bringing in another concept, namely volume. It's an interesting word. It comes from the Latin volvere, meaning to roll. And so it's cognate with such words as evolution and revolution. The original volume was a scroll of papyrus or parchment, usually inscribed in writing, such as here on the left. To read it, the scroll had to be unrolled or evolved, after which it would be rolled up again or revolved. But later, as the scroll gave way to the manuscript book or codex, like here, the continuous roll would be folded into sheets, like a concertina, so that the reader, rather than unrolling the volume, would turn its pages, opening up each fold only to close its predecessor behind. So on turning the page, recto to verso, what was once over goes under, and what was under goes over. But there is no going through, because although every page there, every sheet, has two sides, it was not an interface. Rather, like the mythical Janus, the page was two-faced, and the only way to get from one face or side to the other was by the simultaneous folding and unfolding of the turn. But the codex as here was always open, regardless of the particular page to which it was turned. Not until the manuscript was replaced by the printed word was the book finally closed. For in the printed book, the pages are laid over one another to form a stack. And although you still have to turn the pages to read it, the book itself is now perceived as a thing of layered sheets to be worked through top to bottom as beginning to end, rather than excessive turning as here. And that's why we typically think of the volume these days as a three-dimensional box or container to be filled with contents. The change in the meaning of the word is tied up to the change in the nature of the book, from the scrolls through the codex to the printed book of today. Well, I've already compared the page and the ground. So the question is, has the ground undergone a parallel transformation to the one shown here? That is, from turnover to stack. Well, it's true that you cannot exactly roll up the ground like a scroll, but you can, not unless you go to your garden centre and buy new turf for a lawn, but it's a bit unusual. But you can turn it. So put yourself in the shoes of the medieval ploughman. Go back to him. Here he is on the left. Put yourself into the shoes of the medieval ploughman who would turn the ground with every turn of the seasons in the agricultural calendar. The purpose of ploughing is to bring to the surface nutrient-rich soil from deep down, while burying soil already drained of nutrients by previous cropping, along with any remaining weeds and stubble. And thanks to this continual turnover, the ground will continue to yield year after year. It is repeatedly renewed, not by adding layer upon layer as in a stack, but by breaking it, cutting through with the ploughshare so as to raise the deep and bury the shallow. And that's what makes the ground surface, like the scroll and the codex, into a volume. It's a surface that turns with the seasonal passage of time, with the alternations of weather and the husbandry of crops, wherein the past rises up even as the present sinks below. But with the volume reconceived as a box or a container with contents layered in a stack, time no longer rolls, folds, or turns the ground. It rather pierces through successive grounds like an arrow, pointing either upwards from past to present, or downwards from present to past. Here, every ground, every layer, establishes its own plane of synchrony, while layer succeeds layer in diachronic sequence. To reach the past, as in archaeological excavation, you have to dig down. A memory here is like an archive, deposited in stacks, with the oldest records furthest down. And there they stay, sinking ever deeper as time moves on. As a deposit, the past contains no potential for renewal. It is over. Renewal can come only from superimposition, by adding another layer to the stack, and then another and another. And each successive layer is understood to be a fundamental platform, level, void, and hard, upon which everything stands, each in its proper location. We could perhaps say that the ground of turning is soft. We leave footprints in soft ground, whether in wet mud or sand or snow or moss. And for the same reason, footprints are impermanent and readily eroded by the weather. Prints are temporal things, held within the seasonal round. But the ground of layering, by contrast, is hard. Whereas we leave footprints in the soft earth, on the hard pavement, we can only stamp. Paving, as we've seen, has upper and lower sides. It is interfacial. It has a measured depth, and its support is conditional on the strength or load-bearing capacity of its materials. But the immeasurable depth of soft earth is felt in its embrace of the atmosphere, and this embrace is unconditional. You can fall onto or into the earth, but you cannot fall through it. There can be gaps or holes in a pavement, but in the earth, there are neither gaps nor holes. There are only pits. I rather like this image that I found someone trying to dig a hole, maybe through the sand, but only gets deeper and deeper into the pit. And notice how, when you make a pit in the sand, one of the things you create, maybe unintentionally, is a mound. Now, of course, the final pit in which we end our lives is the grave. I love this picture. It's a diagram, comes from a section of a burial mound from Davenport, Iowa, and it's described in a bulletin of the Smithsonian Institution from 1887, and depicts a burial mound. And here are the people who've been buried inside. Prehistorians always seem to think that if there's a mound, there must be buried bodies inside it. But very often, when they dig their mounds, they find that there's nothing inside it. That the mound is really no different from something that might have been created just because somebody decided to dig a hole. But in this particular case, there were some bodies buried inside it. And yet, it is rather normal in many cultures after burial for the pit to be covered with a slab. So here's a very rough sketch. So here to bury a body, you first dug a hole in the earth, you put the body in there, and then you covered it over with a stone slab here. And of course, the slab, like a paving stone, does have a top side and an underside. And once put in place, it does cover up and conceal the body laid below. Over time, earth and vegetation will accumulate over the burial site, leaving it virtually indistinguishable from its surroundings. So after a few hundred years, we've tree grown here, animals are wandering about, the sun's shining, and it basically looks like this. Perhaps you've decided to put a stone marker up here, so then centuries later, all you see is the stone sticking up there. This is a standing stone from County Cork in Ireland. So over time, earth and vegetation grow over the burial site, leaving it virtually indistinguishable from its surroundings, pending possible rediscovery through archaeological investigation. So is the earth open or closed? Well, perhaps, as the practice of burial suggests, it is both. As generations come and go, the earth alternately opens to the sky and turns against it. So maybe, in a way, both Shepherd and Gibson were right, even though each told only half the story. Thank you very much.